These are the dumbest mastering rules you need to avoid. I've made the mistake of following these rules over the past 10 years at one point or another, so I've got to set the record straight. And the first one is hilarious. Linear phase is mastering grade, or it's better than normal EQ. 2014, 2015, I was using linear phase EQ by Waves, and it's not to knock on this saying it's a bad EQ. It's just that the perception in my mind was that because it was linear phase, it was better, and I was using the accurate method because mastering needs to be accurate. I don't know. It's a bit funny, but here's why you don't use linear phase EQ, and this is how I used to set them up: a low shelf and then two low shelves, one cutting, one boosting, and you can actually hear before and after that pre-ringing, that sort of whoosh into the subs, which once I stopped using linear phase EQ, I had tidal low end, and that was better. So have a listen to this, this low end, and you can specifically hear it zoom into the actual note. When I use linear phase EQ is going to tie into this next rule I used to follow, and that was monoing the low end. I always used to use BX Digital V2 at the time, now we're V3, and I'd use the Monomaker here for the low end. The problem with this is, and we're going to monitor the side signal here, is there is sound design detail in those side signals, and unless there's an issue in the actual side signal having too much low end on one side, or a really weird sub noise coming out of one speaker that's obtuse, you don't really need to mono the low end, and it actually makes it sound worse. So what we're going to do is we're going to listen to the side signal and put this Monomaker at 200 and listen to the side signal and turn this on and off so we can actually hear what information it's taking out of this. Problem with this is there's a lot of tonal information in the actual synth pads that's down low, and there's no point getting rid of it because you're going to ruin the stereo field. You're probably wondering then, what do I do when I have to manage the low end of a side signal? Well, I use linear phase EQ, and you're probably confused about this because you're like, at the start, that's a rule you said to break. Linear phase EQ isn't better. No, it's not better most of the time, but in the circumstance of managing stereo information, it's actually really important. This comes from a conversation I had with Ian Stewart, one of the creators of Basslane Pro, and it really is about fundamentals. So mid-side matrices are sum difference matrices, left plus right, mono, left minus right side. And those plus minuses of the phase relationship after you process it has to be gathered and then put back together in order to maintain the integrity of the left and the right channels. When you use natural phase EQ, so like here in Plugin Doctor, I've got a little shelf here, cut here, it flips the phase at that crossover point. And because it's flipping the phase, it's actually changing the plus minus sum and difference relationships of the matrix when it gets resummed or re-encoded back into left and right. And this is where I'm saying, if I need to manage the low end, this is exactly how I'm going to do it. I'm going to have a linear phase side. I won't use the natural phase, but I've got the natural phase up here because what I did is I got both the same signal with the same filter, one in linear phase, one not in linear phase. And what's actually going to happen, you'll be able to hear how the natural phase one, okay, so this one here is actually changing the stereo information. So I'm monitoring the stereo information, the difference, because of that phase rotation. You'll see a lot more lower end, just like changing where it's placed in the stereo field. So have a listen. Moving on to limiters, it was that true peak limiting sounds bad. And that's a silly rule. It's not necessarily a rule, it's more a notion. People say that true peak limiting sounds worse than normal limiting. I debunk this completely, okay? So you can go watch the video, you can go reference ITU BS 1770 0.1 or 0.4, whatever version they're up to. And basically, true peak limiters just have better gain detection circuits. So the gain detection circuit is oversampled, so they make a more accurate reading, and it reduces more accurately. That's all it's doing. It's a more accurate limiter. It's not necessarily got any difference in attack, release, distortions in terms of the harmonics or the characteristic of the way it limits. It's just simply tracking the waveform more accurately. And that was a big aha moment, because you're not comparing apples with apples when you turn the true peak limiter on. In fact, you're going to get more gain reduction because it's capturing all those intersample peaks. So what you actually have to do is bring your threshold up a little bit to compensate, so you're not having as much compression going on. So true peak limiting doesn't sound bad. I really implore you to watch the full video of me breaking that down, because that was mind-blowing for me to actually go through that process and understand what was happening behind the hood. The next is a really silly one. I got my Manly Varimer over here, and when I got it, I got it 10 years ago, and that was when Gearspace is it Gearspace now? I forgot what they changed the name to, but the forums basically were rampant with lots of gear nerds going, the Manly Varimer, you don't need to do more than 1 dB of compression. Don't need to do more than 1 dB, because it's part of the tone of the box. And I felt like in mastering, if I was doing more than 1 dB, I was doing something bad. Whereas the reality is, I was limiting myself. And up until about 4 or 5 years ago, I kept limiting myself in the amount of compression I'd use on stuff. And then I'd wonder, well, why am I limiting myself? It still sounds too pokey, or it's too dynamic in certain areas. It's silly when people say in mastering you shouldn't do more than 1 or 2 dB of gain reduction. I might have even said it in the past in previous videos, but sometimes it sounds good to push your compressors further, and it doesn't necessarily mean it's directly correlated to a pumpy, squashed master. It's just a creative tool that you have at your availability, which you should be exploring to its full potential, because you don't want to limit how far you can take a master. You really want to push the boundaries. Whether you use no compression or 3 or 4 decibels of compression, it shouldn't matter. What should matter is the end result. And that was a silly rule where no more than 1 dB of compression was sort of pushed on me, and I was just a little bit young and naive at the time and took it on. The next rule, which is super dumb, is that clipping is bad. It's not bad. It's a form of manipulating the tools at your disposal. Even digital clipping, like hard clipping, can be good. It's just how you choose to use it. Now, you don't want to clip on the way out. You want to control your clipping. So typically you want to clip before a limiter. And I used to do that for a while, but one way I'm clipping now, which is far better than anything I've done in the past, is to clip first. And I'll explain why. Whenever I put a clipper before a limiter, anything I was doing before that clipper would change the way the clipper was interacting with the material. Either it would be getting hit a little bit harder or a little bit softer, depending if I did an EQ move or change the amount of compression. And yeah, you can gain stage, but clipping is a very fixed ceiling sort of thing. It's not like a limiter or a compressor that can discern between transient information and sustained information. It is simply, here's a ceiling. If you go over it, this is what I'm going to do. So for the sake of consistency, what I've started doing is using a clipper at the very front of my mastering chain. So that way I've done all these sort of harsh peaks I've gotten rid of ahead of time. And this is how I do it. What I do is in Isotope Audio Editor, I just pull down the ceiling to where I'm just taking the transients off, and I go, oh, you know what? Those transients at about -7-ish, let's just drag that over, -7-ish, they're very fast. They're like exceptionally fast. They're a few samples fast. Let's clip there. And then what I do is I go in a standard clip, open that bad boy up, and yeah, I just set the clipper there, -7, and that will always remain the same. We'll just gain stage up, so we've got a -6 dB ceiling, and yeah, and that's how I just set up my clipping, and it's pretty simple. It's just like it's set, forget. I know that's going to always catch these peaks because there's nothing happening before that process at all, and then I can do what I have to do. And also, it sounds a little bit better too, in my opinion, I should say, because I'm clipping up front. Any of the EQ moves I make, I'm not EQing into the clipper. Because I'm EQing after it, it sounds a little bit more open. Again, opinion-based to my ears and my practices. That's not necessarily the 100% godsend truth on the matter. I just read what my next rule is, and it's actually pretty funny. Dynamic range is king. Okay, so the more dynamic the master is, the better the master is. Okay, I'll give you an example of awesome dynamics. Let's say you're playing in a big band, okay? And, you got your rhythm section, your drums, your bass, your keys, you got the horns playing, some maybe sax playing, it's feeling good. And then the drummer is like, dynamic range is great. The more dynamic range, the better. So he's playing this jazz rhythm, din, 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 and then he just starts smashing the shit out of the snare, and it is super ridiculously loud. It's more dynamic range. Is it better? I don't think so. I think the argument people try to make when they say dynamic range, having more dynamic masters are better, is that they want to hear the natural deviations between the peaks and the troughs. And for every style of music, that's going to be completely different. And it's something to recognize, especially for a lot of us who work on contemporary styles of music, that energy level is forward and in your face and maintained throughout. So that means louder masters with less dynamics. That doesn't mean it's worse. It just means it's a different style of music. And after because there were times I would send out a master to a client that was way more dynamic than the style should be because I thought it was better to be more dynamic. And the clients weren't happy. They were like, well, this isn't as loud as we want it. And it wasn't that they wanted something super loud or crushed. They wanted something with a feeling that was not compressed, but together and forward and full. And having something super dynamic doesn't allow you to do that. So that's one stupid rule where dynamics, like dynamic range day, make everything -14 or whatever. I look at it and I go, I get the premise. In practice, though, there's a more nuanced discussion that people have to have because it just becomes the blind leading the blind at the end of the day, and that's not necessarily good. This was a bad one. All right, I remember getting like heavy metal mixes, all right, early on in my career, and every resonance, every ringing, I would notch out. Okay, this is a silly thing. Resonances are not a bad thing. Sometimes ringing or resonances in a room or from an instrument are a good thing if they're tonal. So if they're harmonious with the original signal, it makes up part of that character. It's a different thing when there's a ringing or resonance that's dissonant with the material, but just because something spikes a little bit or has a little bit of a peak in a certain frequency range doesn't necessarily make it bad, and actually killing it can ruin some of the character. And that's something I learned over time, more so because it just became a thing of using my ears where I dip the resonance and then I put them back in, dip them, put them back in. And I'm like, well, I'm actually losing the feel when I'm dipping it. Why is that? And it's just part of the tone of some instruments or the way things are recorded or produced. So not all resonances, not all ringing is bad. Doesn't mean just because you have a really like Pro Q3 where you can put 24 or 100 different EQ points and notch 50 different things means you should do it. What it does mean is that you have to listen a bit more carefully than just hearing a resonance and wanting to cut it. You have to think musically, creatively, tonally, how does it fit in with the structure of that song? And finally, this was a funny thing that I always felt I read more when I was starting out 10, 12 years ago, was that multibands are bad. They're not good for mastering because they ruin the feel of the music. Now, back a decade ago, yeah, some of the multibands that were out there weren't very good. The crossovers didn't sum back, even when they were completely in bypass, like not bypass, but there was no gain reduction happening. They couldn't sum back together while they sounded weird. I get that. 2023, 2024, Dyne 1 Leaping Audio, I think is killer. Beautiful crossovers. You can do as much compression as you want, and it's not going to really kill the original character of it. You'll hear the compression going on, but the crossovers are really phase coherent. And the other thing is, if you don't have access to a plugin like that, Dan Worrell has an awesome video on how to build a completely phase coherent multiband processor setup within Reaper. You can do it in Pro Tools. I've done it in Pro Tools as well, where basically you can process each of the three bands and have them sum back together with the same phase coherency, which is great. So multiband is not bad. Now, those are the dumbest rules that I followed over the last 10 years. I hope you guys get something out of this. If you've thought of any other dumb rules which people follow, you should definitely leave them in the comment section below. And until next time, take care.